Let's unpack this further. Jasper Knight, who's from the Wits Geography, Archaeology and Environmental Studies Department, speaks to us now. Jasper, good afternoon. Good evening, rather. Thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it. South Africans have very little experience with adverse behavior and adverse weather conditions of this nature. So that means our behavior is not always informed by experience rather than by precaution. Talk to us about what information and data points we need to process as ordinary South Africans and as motorists when we hear these sorts of warnings and we hear the meteorological conditions that lead to these warnings and how that ought to influence our behavior.
Yes, thank you. I mean, that's a very important question, but I think the starting point is actually the information, the behaviour, not of individual citizens, as we all are, but rather we should take the lead from government. And as we saw in last weekend, the actions of the government were completely insufficient at every single level. And they were not only kind of taken by surprise when they shouldn't have been, because the warning was there by the South African Weather Service, but their responses didn't really address the issues that unfolded on the ground. And that was a real concern. Now, of course, you know, you've just played that very long clip of the responsible agencies responding and in an anticipated way for what's going to happen over the next couple of days. And you can see here, of course, they've kind of made it very clear, oh, we were caught out last week, let's not be caught out again. So here, the responses that we undertake individually should also be shaped by the responses of government at different levels. So let's hope that we're not going to experience similar things over the coming days that we had experienced last weekend.
Yeah. As inclement weather opportunities or inclement weather conditions and events become a lot more recurring, but more importantly, become a lot more adverse, what sort of questions ought we ask that we haven't needed to ask before?
Well, I mean, it is important to bear in mind the actual science of climate change and weather and climate prediction. And certainly the information that we have available to us through the work of the South African Weather Service, for example, which you've just shown in the weather forecast, is actually really good. So we have great information about weather and climate events for forthcoming days and weeks. And of course, this should also shape our behaviour, our anticipatory responses. But of course, as a result of climate change, we know that extreme weather and climate events are becoming more common. They are becoming more erratic. And as a consequence, they are often giving rise to impacts that we didn't previously anticipate. But we actually have a good scientific basis for working with this. What we do need, however, is for responsible agencies at different layers of government to be receptive to this scientific advice and to ensure that they develop systems and strategies that themselves become more climate resilient. And at the moment, it's simply not the case.
Yeah. Have we reached a standard of communication about adverse weather conditions that is on par with the global standards? I'll give you an example of the extent of the communication I have received. It is frequent SMSs from my vehicle insurer telling me to watch out for certain areas, to perhaps avoid traveling into certain areas, as this may, as they would warn me, affect whether or not I'd be able to have a vehicle claim from them should I be involved in an accident due to inclement weather, for instance, right? Now, that's something that scares me enough to stay home. Have we, as a society, built an ecosystem around the communication of adverse weather conditions that is sufficient?
Well, the short answer is no, we haven't. And your example there really demonstrates the fact that we may receive this information from other sources, from private businesses or from our neighbours or community organisations and so on. But of course, the buck stops with government. It's their responsibility to keep their citizens safe. And here, therefore, very often they don't communicate very effectively to either local communities or to other stakeholders in an area that might be affected by a certain type of weather and climate event, such as a snowfall or a flood. And it's that miscommunication between layers of government and communities that really needs to be improved, because without this, communities are not going to be kept kept safe against the negative impacts of these events when they take place, and they will take place.
Yeah. Jasper, just lastly, as we've learned from COVID-19, when you want to warn people about adversity and you want people's behavior to change accordingly, sometimes you need to deal with some material conditionalities around it. So people who are not able to opt out of a work commitment, for instance, or whose livelihood depends on being able to travel along a certain route, they don't care much for a weather warning if that means that they don't eat for the day or that they're not able to, make a living on that day. And government will tell you that we don't have a long enough lead time into assisting in such a way when we know about adverse weather conditions, because in most times we know a few days before. Do you have a response around how we can strategically solve that?
Well, the short answer is the best way to keep communities and the environment safe and resilient under future climate change and weather events is to decrease the vulnerability of those systems. So here, we live in a very unequal society still after decades of democracy, and the fundamental factors giving rise to vulnerable communities still haven't been addressed. There is still insufficient education and water and food and transport networks and housing and sanitation systems. So until you provide these fundamental bases that allow people and communities to become more resilient, people are always going to be affected by these events. So here you need to address things right at the very start, rather than just, giving someone a food parcel if they have been affected at the end of an event. So here, fundamentally addressing these unequal conditions that give rise to vulnerability is the starting point of any good democratic society. And in so doing, here we decrease the likelihood that individuals and communities are going to be affected by such events in future.
Yeah. Jasper Knight, thank you so much for your insights. Really do appreciate it. Jasper Knight is from the Wits Geography, Archaeology and Environmental Studies Department.